Earlier this year I was given a present and told not to get my hopes up as I opened the parcel in a flurry of excitement and anticipation. Once inside, I was amused to see this Olympia NK5050 complete with its flash gun and original packaging. Obviously I just had to do a video on such an amazing find. The first time I came across one of these so-called Scameras was when a colleague tried to sell me a really great camera outfit with all the accessories. I took one look at the Olympia camera and flash gun sitting in its poor quality aluminium case and politely turned down their kind offer. Since then I've kept seeing these things pop up, sometimes at rather ambitious prices, with words like rare or collectible added to the description for that extra value. Now, although there's nothing technically wrong with a cheap plastic camera, people were sometimes misled into paying more for these cameras than they were worth. From a distance, the whole setup could potentially look quite impressive, and the names they carried sounded vaguely like well-known brands. Olympia for Olympus, Nikai for Nikon, and so on. I've even seen photos of these things bearing actual Canon, Nikon and Pentax badges, and it should be blatantly obvious that these companies played no part in making these cameras. So let's start by looking at some of the impressive looking specifications on the box. Retractable zoom type lens. Well, I'm glad they used the word type in that description, because although it may look like you're zooming the lens when you rotate the collar, all it's actually doing is changing the aperture. The front glass or plastic does nothing to the focal length of the lens. You can see the apertures marked on the zoom section. And even those are a joke, because moving from f6.3 to f8 only moves the square aperture blades in towards the wide open orifice behind, so it's still wide open, and then you have two vague attempts at f11 and f16. Dual viewfinder. Actually it does have two viewfinders. A waist level finder that has something like a 4:3 aspect ratio, and a straight ahead finder that has more of a 3:2 aspect ratio to match the film. However, this viewfinder has a much wider angle of view than the lens, and I ended up cropping things off in several shots, so you need to leave lots of breathing space around your subject when composing your image on this camera. Then they go on to say big colour viewfinder. It's just a plain optical viewfinder, of course it's colour. The 9 different control modes just seem to be there to make a big impressive looking list, often repeating the same feature. My favourite mode has to be red eye reduction mode and flash off. Did they not think this through before printing the packaging? Auto exposure? No, no, and thricely no. The camera has a fixed shutter speed that fires at around 1/40th of a second, and you set the aperture manually. The camera itself has no auto exposure. Although there is a semblance of auto exposure if you're using the flash, because in auto flash mode there's a CDS cell behind this hole in the camera body, and if the lighting is relatively bright the flash won't fire, whereas if it's a bit darker or you happen to have covered the hole with your fingers as you grip the camera, then the flash will fire. So it's just an auto flash on or off rather than a variable exposure. And the flash just has a single power setting, giving you all or nothing. And hopefully these flash bursts will show on the video now I've slowed the frame rate, otherwise you'll just have to take my word for it that the flash fired when I covered the CDS cell. So we'll take a quick look round the camera, which really won't take long at all. Then I'll show a few shots taken using the camera, and after that I guess it would be only right to take the thing apart to see what makes it tick. On the front we have the fake zooming lens. The actual lens is the small reflective bit just in front of the aperture blades. Then there's the hole for the auto flash CDS cell, with a sensor for the infrared remote control next to that. I don't have the remote control, but that really doesn't matter. Above that is the red eye reduction light, which is just a red LED that blinks a few times before the shot fires. This same LED is the self-timer countdown indicator, which illuminates solid for a few seconds, then blinks a few times, before the shutter fires about 10 seconds or so later. The window for the waist level viewfinder is here, and the straight through viewfinder is over here. On the top is the hot shoe and the waist level viewfinder, and on the right is the on-off switch with the shutter button in front of that. The mode button toggles between red eye reduction, remote control mode and self-timer mode, and then one more press to return to normal operation. And the flash button selects between auto flash, flash permanently on and flash off, all of which can be completely ignored if you haven't got the flash connected. The last button is the rewind button, should you wish to rewind the film before the end. And that brings me to one good feature, not that it's unique to this camera, but when you rewind the film it leaves the leader showing, so if you're developing your own film you don't have to go fishing for the leader. Although I'm not sure how many potential customers for this camera would be doing their own developing. When you get to the end of the film it auto rewinds, or at least that's the theory. I'd put a couple of dummy rolls through the camera before I committed to real film, and those wound all the way to 36 exposures. But when I put an actual film in, I heard the auto wind slowing on frame 30, and after frame 31 it just rewound the film. So I called it a day at that, leaving the last 5 shots blank. On the back is the straight-through viewfinder and the film door, which is opened by pulling down on this lever on the left-hand side of the camera. On the bottom is the tripod socket and the battery hatch for the 2 AA batteries. This was another thing that gave me some problems. The film had been in for a couple of weeks, and I had a bit of time one day, so I thought I'd head out to get some shots of buildings, as the light was quite good. I walked for about half an hour to get to my photo location, and the camera wouldn't work. I took the batteries out and reinserted them, but nothing, so I carried on taking a few shots on another camera instead. When I got home and looked properly, there was some sort of corrosion on the battery terminals, and once I'd scraped that off, the camera came back to life. The batteries were brand new and hadn't leaked, so I can only assume that there had been some electrolyte lurking around from some previous batteries which corroded the contacts on my fresh batteries. Kind of a pity, because the shots I was planning might have looked quite good through the rather challenged plastic lens that's fitted to this camera. So after all that, I'm sure you're dying to see some of the shots taken on the Olympia. I didn't want to invest too much in the camera, so I grabbed a roll of the cheapest film I had in stock, which was Ilford FP4 Type 517 Cine Film. I talked about this film in a previous video, link in the description. And now on with the sample shots. I had expected this camera to be utterly rubbish, and in many ways it doesn't disappoint on that front, but some of the shots have actually turned out rather well. Obviously the lens isn't sharp, not even in the centre, where if your subject is something like 10 to 15 feet away, it's only sort of sharpish. Then as you move out towards the edges it just gets softer and softer. The lens vignettes like a crazy thing, but on the right shot that can give you quite a moody atmosphere. In fact, I think moody and atmospheric is how I'd describe many of the shots taken on the Olympia. I'm sure I'll have shaken some of the shots due to the slow shutter speed, but it's kinda difficult to tell because everything is blurry anyway. So the next task is to take the camera apart. It's quite heavy, so I'm expecting to find a chunk of metal in there somewhere. Well, that's the camera apart, and I have to say it's somewhat more underwhelming than I expected. The front section, including the lens, is attached with 4 screws and a few clips. As I thought, there's a chunk of metal in the grip section. I'd expected this to be steel, but it's non-magnetic and very soft, so I guess it's probably lead or an alloy of some form because it looks quite bright for lead. The aperture mechanism is very crude, and as observed earlier, moving from f6.3 to f8 makes no difference to the aperture. If I set it to f16 and push the activating pins inwards, now it looks more like the correct size, and also from here the aperture on f8 sort of works, but as soon as I open it wide again it doesn't close properly due to the slop in the mechanism. Moving on to the other half of the camera, there's another chunk of lead beside the film chamber. Then there's a solenoid just down here that pulls on this tab of metal, which in turn opens the 2-bladed shutter. The solenoid just receives a brief pulse of electricity, which makes the shutter open for about 1/40th of a second before closing again. The winding motor is housed inside the film take-up drum. Then there's a gear train to transfer the drive through to the rewind crank. I'm guessing that when the motor spins in one direction, the take-up drum rotates, and when it's reversed, the drive disengages from the take-up drum and transfers to the rewind gear chain. There's a PCB in the top of the case with a blob covering the chip that does the clever stuff like driving the LCD screen. Then another board beneath that, populated with connectors and a few discrete components. That board is covered in flux residue and is pretty sloppily soldered too. In the corner beside the shutter button contact is something that looks suspiciously like a date, 20/03/2003, but surely this camera wouldn't be as recent as that. Well, maybe it would. In fact, there's a similar code on the other board, 22/3/2003. If these are date codes, it would be for when the PCB was designed rather than when the camera was assembled. I think that's enough of the inside, so I'll pop it back together and return shortly. I've had quite a giggle using the Olympia. I knew it wasn't going to be sharp or contrasty, so I was looking for bold subjects with plenty of contrast themselves, in the hopes of creating something other than mush in the final image. The auto film wind is amazingly slow, and it sounds like it's struggling with every single shot. I didn't bother using the flash. I think I'd be too self-conscious walking around with the entire kit, but maybe no one would even notice. Just walking around with the camera, I wasn't aware of anyone taking any notice of me or the camera. Should you buy one yourself? Maybe, if you want a giggle and you understand the limitations, of which there are many. As for a price guide, for me, I think you shouldn't pay more than the price of a roll of film for one of these cameras. There's loads of them out there. I saw one recently on a market stall priced at £25 and labelled as an SLR camera working. Anyway, I think that will do for this video. If you've enjoyed watching, please like the video and maybe even subscribe to the channel, not forgetting to click on the bell icon so you get notifications when future videos are released. That's it for now, so thanks for watching and I'll see you in a future video.